During the 1980s, inflation averaged 750% a year, reaching a peak of 4,924% in December 1989. The main cause was a persistent government budget deficit that was financed by the country's central bank, which led to high inflation. This resulted in an extreme increase in the price of products, as well as the drastic rise of the unemployment rate. Industrial production rates also dropped as employees were let go and businesses shut down.
What is a business cycle? The business cycle, or economic cycle, represents all the variations of a country's economic activities. These activities include investment, employment, production, income level, and stock market operations. It is measured using the rise and fall in real gross domestic products, or GDP, which is the total value of goods and services produced in a country. The business cycle has four main stages: expansion, peak, contraction, and trough, which means that certain phases can be anticipated. The expansion is known as the prosperity phase. The economy has a steady flow in the money supply with an increase in production and demand. There is low employment rate and investment is booming. However, inflation starts to rise in this stage too. The second stage is a peak, when the economy reaches the maximum level of growth and inflation is high. Recession is a period of contraction. The economy is growing, but in smaller proportions. During a recession, unemployment rises, production slows down, sales start to drop because of a decline in demand, and income becomes stagnant or decline. During depression, economic growth continues to drop, while unemployment rises and production plummets. Consumers and businesses find it hard to secure credit, trade is reduced, and bankruptcies start to increase. Consumers' confidence and investment levels are also very, very low. Trough is when there is further decline in the economy until the prices of factors, as well as demand and supply of goods and services, reach their lowest. At this stage, inflation is at its lowest as well. In recovery, the economy starts to turn around. Low prices spur an increase in demand, employment, and production starts to rise. And lenders start to open their credit coffers. This stage marks the end of one business cycle and the beginning of a new one. Inflation always tends to follow the flow of a business cycle. During a peak, the economy is failing to satisfy the goal of eliminating inflation. In a trough, inflation is at its lowest. However, the risks of deflation start to set in.
What is inflation? Inflation is the constant rise in the general level of prices, where a unit of currency buys less than it did in prior periods. Sustained inflation occurs when a nation's money supply growth outpaces economic growth. Inflation is classified into three types: demand pull inflation, cost push inflation, and built-in inflation. Demand pull inflation occurs when the overall demand for goods and services in an economy increases more rapidly than the economy's production capacity. A distinct example of demand pull inflation is the oil industry. Over the last decade, the demand for oil has increased significantly. However, oil is a scarce resource, so there is only a limited amount available on our planet. In this demand and supply graph, it demonstrates the effect of oil on demand-pull inflation. A higher demand of oil causes the demand curve to shift to the right, leading to an increase in the price level. On the other hand, it results in a decrease in supply. However, the supply curve remains constant. Additionally, an increase in money supply in an economy also leads to inflation. With more money available to individuals, the positive consumer sentiment leads to higher spending. This increases the demand and leads to a rise in the price level. Money supply can be increased by the monetary authorities either by printing and giving away more money to the individuals, or by devaluating the currency. In all such causes of demand increase, the money loses its purchasing power. The next type of inflation is known as the cost-push inflation. It is a result of an increase in the prices of production process inputs. The higher input prices causes the aggregate supply curve to shift to the left, whereas the aggregate demand curve doesn't change. As a result, the price level increases from P1 to P2. So unlike demand-pull inflation, cost-push inflation is caused by a shift in supply. As for built-in inflation, it occurs when the price of goods and services rises, which makes labor expect and demand more costs or wages to maintain their cost of living. Their increased wages result in higher cost of goods and services, and the spiral continues as one factor induces the other and vice versa. Inflation is both good and bad depending upon which side one takes. For example, individuals with tangible assets, like property or stocked commodities, may like to see some inflation as that raises the value of their assets, which they can sell at a higher rate. However, the buyers of such assets may not be happy with the inflation, as they will be required to spend more money. To combat inflation, a country's appropriate monetary authority, like the central bank, takes the necessary measures to keep inflation within permissible limits and keep the economy running smoothly. On the other hand, the central bank can cause inflation due to the implementations of the wrong economic policies or the excess printing of notes and cash.
A central bank is a financial institution given privileged control over the production and distribution of money and credit for a nation or a group of nations. In modern economies, the central bank is usually responsible for the formulation of monetary policy and the regulation of member banks. Many central banks are not government agencies, and so are often touted as being politically independent. However, even if a central bank is not legally owned by the government, its privileges are established and protected by law. Central banks control and manipulate the national money supply by issuing currency and setting interest rates on loans and bonds. Typically, central banks raise interest rates to slow growth and avoid inflation. They lower them to spur growth, industrial activity, and consumer spending. Central banks also regulate member banks through capital requirements, reserve requirements, which dictate how much banks can lend to customers and how much cash they must keep on hand, and deposit guarantees, among other tools. Finally, A central bank also acts as an emergency lender to distressed commercial banks and other institutions, and sometimes even a government. For example, by purchasing government debt obligations, the central bank provides a politically attractive alternative to taxation when a government needs to increase revenue.